First of all, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Where Can Change Begin, where we want to address gender-based violence through grassroots work. I would like to thank everyone for joining us this evening to join this important discussion in tackling gender-based violence and also the role of communities, faith, and grassroots action in driving meaningful change. So this evening we will explore the critical work of being done to address gender-based violence and highlight some practical ways that we can all contribute to create a safer and also more inclusive community. So we are very happy to have three speakers, each bringing a wealth of knowledge, experience, and expertise to this discussion. So I'll briefly introduce them. First, I want to introduce Elsabeth King, from who is the membership and programs lead of the Faith and VAWG Coalition. She has over 20 years of experience in international development, and she also specializes in addressing issues impacting women and girls, including domestic and abuse and harmful practices such as child marriage. Next, I also want to introduce Natasha, who is the founder of Bold Voices, which is an award-winning social enterprise that empowers educational communities to tackle gender inequality and also gender-based violence. So she has a master's in gender and international relations, and she has worked a lot with schools, universities, and organizations across the whole of the UK to deliver lectures and workshops on these themes. And finally, we also have Professor Joht S Chandan, who is a clinical professor of public health at the University of Birmingham. Professor Chandan's pioneering research focuses on the public health impacts of abuse and violence, and he also sheds light on the long-term health consequences of domestic abuse. He also serves as scientific advisor for the Lancet Commission on Violence Against Women and Children, and he is a frequent contributor to leading media outlets like the BBC and the Sky News. So thank you all our speakers for taking the time to join us and share your insights with us tonight. I would like to invite each of them to share a brief introduction about their work, their approach to tackling gender-based violence, and how their efforts contribute to this cause.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be joining you and hopefully to be sharing some useful insights from our work at Bold Voices. So we are a prevention first organization, and the way that we approach that is through education. We do work primarily with schools, with secondary schools across the UK, to support schools to challenge and tackle the issues of gender inequality and gender-based violence. And most of the work that we do is directly with young people themselves through talks, through workshops, and we run peer training and peer mentor schemes and different programs working directly with young people. But we also work with staff in schools, and we also work with parents and carers as well. Where possible, we try and work across a school community in all of the schools that we work in, knowing how important it is that every kind of pillar within that school has the knowledge and the skills to challenge and tackle these different issues. So to introduce to you a little bit about our approach, we see gender-based violence as an issue that is connected to wider issues of gender inequality. And we support schools and school communities to understand the root causes of gender-based violence and to really support the individuals within that school community to be curious about those root causes. So we work a lot with the continuum model of sexual harassment and sexual violence. You might have heard of Professor Liz Kelly and the work that she's done around that idea of a continuum. So that is a pyramid image And we're supporting people to see the connections between different issues on that pyramid, leading from gender stereotypes and gendered attitudes and language, all the way through to experiences of gender-based violence. I can go into a little bit more detail about that a little bit later on, but that gives you an insight into some of the work that we do.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the brief introduction. I'm pretty sure there is a lot that you can share, and we will have the opportunity to do this through the session. Thank you very much. Elsa, would you like to share a little bit about your work at Faith and VAWG?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you this evening, and thank you for coming. I know it's the end of the day, but we really appreciate you're here. So my name is Elsa. I work in the Faith and Violence Against Women and Girls, or VAWG Coalition. The coalition is a registered charity in the UK. It's a national charity and it brings together over, at the moment, 45 organizations and individuals working on the intersections of faith, race, feminism, and ending violence against women and girls. Our main mission is to build bridges between members of faith communities or faith-centric organizations and domestic violence and abuse specialist organizations within the sector. Currently, we are the only national body in the UK that brings activists, organizations, and communities working on intersections of faith and violence against women and girls, and that centers the voice of survivors. We exist because the history starts from, there is a huge gap, lack of understanding of the role of faith of women of faith going through domestic abuse. There is a lack of understanding by the VAWG sector, and also sometimes, even if there is understanding, completely ignored. But women keep saying that, our faith helps us to get through it. Our faith is important to us. It's part of our life. And also there is a huge lack of understanding of spiritual abuse or using faith as a weaponization. So we're here to bridge that gap. I'll stop here. I don't know if I covered everything.
Thank you very much. No, I think it was a good introduction. And the same as I said to Natasha, we will have the opportunity to explore more during the session and after as well. Yeah, so thank you. And finally, Professor Joht, can you please give a little bit of insight of your work?
Yeah, no, thank you. So firstly, thank you so much. It's an absolute privilege to participate in this discussion this evening, and it's wonderful just to meet everybody. So my name's Joht Singh. I'm a clinical professor of public health at the University of Birmingham. So what does that mean in practice? So half of my week I work as a clinical medical consultant in public health, and for the other half of the week I work as an academic at the university. My work largely really revolves around sort of understanding and tackling some of those profound health impacts of violence against women and children. But I thought actually, just as we're going through the introduction, I thought what might be more interesting is if I just give you a bit of a brief anecdote as to how or why I've actually gone into this space and sort of where my interest has really started from. So more than a decade ago, quite some time ago, during my undergraduate studies when I was at medical school. So I trained in London during that period, and everybody knows living in London is quite expensive and it's quite difficult at many points. And I thought, okay, it's a good chance for me to get a part-time job. And I noticed that there are adverts for you to join the Metropolitan Police and to become a special constable. And I was really excited that if you're a special constable in the police, you've got free travel in London. I thought this is such a brilliant idea. I'm going to go ahead and go ahead with this, because lots of people think, oh, I'm joining it for altruistic purposes. There was nothing altruistic on the onset. You realize very quickly after joining the police as a special constable that it's absolutely not worth it for any amount of free travel. And actually, there's a lot of things that the police deal with. But something struck me during my experience actually of being a special constable in the Met, and it's just something that's pretty much just lived with me ever since. So I think I was really sort of aghast sort of with seeing what the prevalence is, so just the sheer number of people who've been affected by violence in their life. And something really struck me, particularly as a medical student at that point in time, that not just the number of people who are affected by what is ultimately a human rights travesty, but also a lot of the individuals who have or were affected had a huge amount of unmet medical needs. And actually, one of the reasons for that happening was that their voices were suppressed potentially through the healthcare system, or they just didn't feel that they had the opportunity to share those needs. And I had lots of stories during that period whilst I was a police officer where individuals were experiencing pain or mental health conflicts or potential physical effects of violence or abuse in the long term or long run. But people just played down, some of those experiences as almost nothing. So that was just something which I just was absolutely astounded by that point. So it was a bit of a turning point in my career, and it's something which I just really felt extremely passionate to want to work to resolve. So as I continued through my training and sort of continue to work in medicine and go into public health, I realized that from my perspective, understanding and addressing some of these health consequences and preventing violence is an absolute must in what would be a successful society in terms of also one of the most important things from my perspective in terms of addressing societal public health. So that was just where it stems from. So since then, I've done lots of work in this area. So currently, I'm the UK lead for 2 international networks. So just as Evan mentioned, the Lancet Commission on Violence Against Women and Children, and also a UK government-funded global health group on violence. And a lot of the work that our teams do is just really trying to understand not just what the consequences are, but actually how can we support individuals, and also how can we provide an opportunity or a safe space to get the voice of survivors either into some of the healthcare commissioning or decision-making systems, and also how can we design interventions or actual solutions with survivors in mind. So that's really where a lot of the work that me and my team really focus on.
Thank you. That's quite interesting journey. And just taking the opportunity that you were talking about this, I would like to ask you a question for you. Because you also, we know that your research has highlighted also long-term health impact and of the gender-based violence. So can you share a little bit more about how also witnessing abuse affects not only the survivors but also those around them, and also the mental health impacts on the survivors and those around, and how can we react when we are witnessing or we suspect there's some kind of abuse and violence is taking place?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. So I think you almost hit the nail on the head in the question itself. So the long-term impacts of gender-based violence are absolutely profound and far-reaching, but not only for survivors, but also those around them as well. So whether that's friends, families, entire communities. So witnessing abuse in itself can have a degree of ripple effect. So we've seen in lots of research studies, and also, I mean, just in lots of experience that we've had also working with survivors, that actually it creates a cycle of trauma that extends beyond the survivor. So for friends and family, seeing a loved one endure violence can lead to secondary trauma in its own right. Also, there's feelings of anxiety or helplessness, and in particular for children who have witnessed violence, particularly seeing that exposure to violence in the household, whether it's directly or indirectly, can also have lifelong consequences. And this is something which I don't think we tend to think about enough. So, being a child in that environment can have real physical consequences, so potential developmental delays or physical health conditions later in life. So there's impacts in the immediacy, but also there are impacts in the community beyond also those immediately affected. So even at a community level, I think it's worth just considering that widespread gender-based violence actually creates effectively a culture of fear and almost normalization of abusive behaviors. I suspect actually Natasha and Elsa will probably chip in on this, but just having so much exposure to violence in so many different contexts, it almost erodes trust and social relationships just in society as a whole. So, these societal costs are huge in their own right. But just very briefly, sort of answering the second point that you mentioned. So, how should we respond if we are witnessing abuse? I think the most important concepts are our responses should be informed, compassionate, but also guided by an understanding of that particular survivor's safety and autonomy. So there's a few steps that we can take. So most importantly, absolutely about prioritizing safety. So if you yourself have witnessed any immediate harm, do call emergency services or relevant authorities to ensure your safety and also the safety of the survivors, because just as you mentioned, such interventions can also save lives in their own right. But if you're talking about something in sort of the longer context, I think one of the most important things that I've seen actually is to be a good bystander in that context, you've got to be a really supportive and compassionate listener. So if the abuse isn't immediate in that context, but you know somebody who is in an abusive situation, do approach them with care. You've got to listen without judgment and avoid any degree of blaming language. I think this is something which, as a society, we don't do particularly well at the moment, but it's something which we really need to focus on. And also just let them know that you're there to support them. Ultimately, survivors do need to feel empowered and not controlled in this situation. But you want to empower them so they can make the best decisions about their own sort of situation and care. And probably the last thing that I'd just really focus on is I think everybody in society and community also has a duty to be able to have a degree of understanding of how to provide informational resources if you know somebody who is in this situation. You don't have to be an expert in this space to know that there's certain, big national charities, big organizations or support pathways that you can direct people to. And actually many survivors themselves, due to that situation, just may not know where to turn or feel too isolated in that moment. So I think it's really important for us to really step in. And actually, just the last point, because it's also linked to what Elsa and Natasha said in the introduction. But I think we also have a duty as well to also challenge some of those harmful norms that we have at a societal level. So I think that's also important within our response if we're witnessing abuse. We do have a responsibility to speak out against attitudes and behaviours that do condone violence, but obviously whilst maintaining a degree of safety yourself as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's very important that sometimes we are not really sure how to help, but yeah, I think as you mentioned, the compassion is really a key also, and to identify when is a life-saving situation and immediately act. That's quite important. I would like to ask Elsa. Because you work with many different faith organizations, so I would like to know how do you think is important for faith organizations to speak out more about gender-based violence, and is there much difference in how different faith groups approach gender-based violence?
That's a very good, important question. Faith communities, it depends, most of the time, it depends on who you're talking to, because generally, I think there is so much to be done within the faith communities, understanding gender-based violence, as Professor Joht was saying earlier. There should be not just the leaders, but also the communities understanding it, because the faith communities is part of the community, and understanding that and the context of, within the faith itself, it's really, really important. And one thing, working in the coalition as a membership lead, one thing I've learned is we have very different type of faith groups, faith organizations working. But one thing I've learned is there is no God that encourages or that appreciates violence. There is no God. There is no faith or belief that encourages violence. So that's the basic common ground. But at the same time, we also know that abusive, coercive, people with coercive behavior, narcissist people, they belong to any faith. There is no discrimination. They're everywhere. If it's not faith, it's something else. So, appreciating that, understanding that, instead of saying, oh, no, this doesn't happen in our community, just have an open mind of like, this can happen. And that's why, when we think about spiritual abuse, that's where it comes from, because that person uses spirituality to abuse others surrounding them. So it's really important to appreciate that. I don't know if I answered your question, but I can continue with that.
Yeah, no, I think it does, and I think it is very important for those faith communities to be aware that it can happen and that they have a point of help and support. I think, right, for women and children in need, or well, anyone who is suffering domestic violence.
Yeah,
Thank
they
you. Yeah.
could be one of. Sorry to add in this,
No,
because
thank you.
we did a survey with women of faith survivors in about 2-3 years ago during COVID time. And one of the things is, faith communities are the first point of contact for women and children when these things happen. So that place, the faith communities could be the first place, like a safe place they can go. And if safe plans are in place, that's where it starts. It's not just signposting, like call the police or call the national helpline, but they are themselves can be a safeguarding place, they point of contact, and they can even create a place where the women and children can stay safely within the community rather than stigmatizing.
Yeah, so they actually play a very important role in being the
Yeah.
first contact when someone is in need. Thank you very much for the insight. Now, Natasha, may I ask you a question? Because you work with schools, with boys and girls and stuff as well, do you use different approach, or do you notice some different response between boys and girls? And also, how do you talk to young people with different religious, continuing this topic, cultural and racial backgrounds about these issues? Is there a different approach that you use?
Thank you so much for the question. So at the core of our facilitation and education approach is a kind of the values of curiosity and empathy. And those are values that are guided no matter who the young person is that we're working with and who the facilitator is who's working with those young people. So obviously we have a kind of ethos within the organization overall, but then we also have our facilitator body. We have around 15 facilitators who we work with, and they all have obviously varying different identities and backgrounds that they're coming from. So we spend a lot of time thinking about this idea of positionality as facilitators, like what is our identity and how are we bringing that to the space, and how does that potentially change and interact with our, like, kind of how we're working with each young person in that space. But what I would say at its core, we're always coming back to that curiosity and empathy. And one of the things that we always come back to is the idea that who we are as a facilitator, or who the young person is that we're speaking to, doesn't decide what we can and can't talk about in that space, but it does shape how you have that conversation. So not the fact that the conversation is happening, but how that conversation is held. And again, like, therefore then coming back to that curiosity and empathy, asking questions, creating a space for understanding, and genuine curiosity is so important. And I'd say, like, for us, the approach that we're taking is understanding this culture overall. And when we're thinking about the difference, for example, between how we might approach this with girls and boys, we're really wanting any young person that we work with to see how they are connected to this issue of gender inequality and gender-based violence, and that they experience harm as a result of that culture. And a big misunderstanding that we come across, and actually it's something that Jean, you mentioned when you introduced the work that you've been doing, is that of course men and boys are affected by these issues too, and also may well experience forms of sexual harassment and sexual violence as well. And they're also affected by gender inequality in other ways. And we talk a lot about the way that the expectations that we place on men and boys around masculinity. We think a lot about the pressures that they face, and how that can result in things like not speaking out, not seeking help for mental health, and other ways that it harms men and boys as well. So it's not necessarily that we take a different approach, but that we try and find ways with each young person to connect to this culture and this issue overall. And then the next part, that's the empathy piece. So once that young person has made a connection themselves, it's about how they step into the shoes of other people to understand how other people are affected by this culture too. So there's lots of different ways that we might go about doing that. But I keep mentioning them and I'll keep going back to it, but the curiosity and empathy are kind of our, like, bread and butter of how we do that at Bold Voices, to really, like, make sure that all young people are feeling engaged in that conversation and can connect to it. And I think also on the second question as well, intersectionality and thinking about how different parts of identity affect this issue is really important in this work. So by that, I mean, if we're touching on parts of identity like religion, like race, like sexuality, like class, and then obviously also gender is going to be one of those parts of our identity as well. So we're always thinking about how all of those parts of identity shape and change these experiences. And it's not just the experience itself, but then as Joht's been talking about, as Elsa's been talking about, it's also about how you might receive support in the aftermath of that violence. It's how you might seek out certain organizations, how that might be received, the kind of attitudes that you might face when you are seeking help, all those different things that might happen. So that's a really important part of the work we do as well, and really centering that idea of intersectionality in that education and in our approach to that education as well.
Thank you. I actually would like to extend, it's very interesting, but I would like to extend to also intergenerational approach, because I know that you also work with staff and parents or teachers. Is there any different approach, or are they more resistant, or I don't know, or do they interact the way they are learning with the children? How does that work? How do they communicate with each other? How does it go?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we do work with adults a lot as well. So whether that's staff or teachers in schools, as well as parents and carers, I would say on the whole, most of the adults that we come into contact with in our work are very much on board and engaged with understanding it. And I will say that we've seen a change in that in the last few years. We've been doing this work at Bold Voices for 6 years now. And in 2021, there was a real shift in approach to this issue within the education sector in the UK. People might, well, if you think back to 2021, you might remember some of the things that were happening in the media around gender-based violence and violence against women and girls at the time. In particular, there was the case of Sarah Everard, and that kind of led to a real big conversation about violence against women and girls in the UK. And at the same time, there was a conversation happening within education and amongst young people, and there was an Ofsted review into sexual abuse and sexual harassment in schools. And we saw this real shift, this real moment. And one of the things that the Ofsted review stated is that school settings should assume that online sexual abuse and sexual harassment are happening in their school settings, even when there are no specific reports. And that was a real change for the education sector, because before that point, it had been very much like, oh, we don't get any reports of this, therefore we don't have this problem. And after this Ofsted review, there was a shift in attitude of actually hearing these reports is a good thing. We know it's happening. So if we're not getting reports from young people, that means that they don't feel comfortable reporting, or they don't know where to report, or they don't know what to report, lots of different things. And so that shift was a really important one that happened, and it led to a lot more openness from adults in the lives of young people to understand this issue better. So we do approach the conversation slightly differently with them, but we're still building knowledge and we're still building curiosity and empathy. We try and really upskill teaching staff to know how to challenge these different issues and to know what to challenge, and in particular that prevention-led approach. So most teaching staff that we work with know that if a report of gender-based violence comes to them, or even if they witness a form of gender-based violence, sexual harassment or something in school, they know to report that and to deal with it. But the things that are often missed are the stereotypes, the attitudes, the day-to-day norms that are just going on very normalized, very unnoticed within school life. So those are the things we really focus on, being able to notice them and then being able to challenge them, and to challenge them in a way that centers that curiosity and empathy first. How do we create a space of call in and like, let's learn together, rather than it always being a sanction and a punishment, but actually how do we learn as a school community? And that's a really important part of that approach with adults, is upskilling them and growing their confidence to hold those conversations in that way. So yeah, it is. One final thing to say on the intergenerational thing, I think, is that we sometimes do see a real distancing from adults who we work with, who might say things like, oh, I just don't understand why it's got so bad with young people today. Like, it wasn't like that in our day. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to say that because we spend a lot of time thinking about the online sphere and how gender-based violence exists online for young people, which it does. And obviously that is kind of a new form of gender-based violence that a lot of adults maybe didn't experience themselves growing up. So that can make it feel quite distant. But I think also once we start building knowledge of what we actually mean by gender-based violence, a lot of adults start to notice that experience in their own lives of, oh, wait, hang on a second. No, I do notice the fact that sexual harassment was very normal when I was growing up, and that those stereotypes and norms and attitudes were just part and parcel of daily life. So we try to help adults to see a connection to the issue rather than pushing it away and being like, this is not something that I experienced. And that can be difficult, and that takes time to kind of work through that. But yeah, that's definitely an important part of the work as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was very insightful to know. I was really wondering because the way we experience is different, then we have a completely different idea. And then how can we help if we don't fully understand how things work nowadays, right? Okay, so thank you. Elsa, I would like to go back to you. Talking about those different approaches, I was just wondering, because you work with very different faith-based groups, so what challenges have you encountered, if any, and what strategies have worked well in helping these groups to collaborate and make a positive impact when tackling gender-based violence?
Yeah, the challenges are quite a lot, but I try to summarize them as short as possible. I think I'll start from one of our members once said to me, being a feminist and being a faithful woman can be a lonely place, because you go to the church and you're too feminist, and you go to your work, which is in the secular, the VAWG sector, you have faith, so it's like it's a lonely place. So that applies to the Faith and VAWG Coalition as well, because when you are working with building the trust between faith-based communities and secular groups, because they both have the same mission, maybe, because to end gender-based violence, but they have different priorities. So not belonging to both of them, but trying to build a bridge and building the trust in the first place is one of the challenges, because the faith group thinks we are too secular and critical of faith and religion. And when we go to secular sector, they think we have faith and we are related to a faith. So that building bridge is one of the issues. The other one is we're not interfaith groups, but sometimes we're misunderstood as if we are an interfaith group. But our work addresses violence against women and girls from a faith-informed perspective. And also we create a movement for other people, organizations or faith groups, anyone who wants to fight violence against women and girls. So we are a platform, in the lens of social justice and faith tradition. So that's another challenge we have. The third one, which is already a little bit touched, is but really, really difficult one, is working with systems of oppression. We say that because faith can be racialized. Some people, you just people look at them and say, oh, she belongs to this faith or that faith. Or it could be, like assuming that they belong to a faith group. Or it could be the other way around of we meet so many white Christian women, but they say I have faith, but nobody take it into consideration. There is that assumption of, the secularism of it. So that's another issue, like, the oppression, the system of, the prejudice and all things together. The other one I think it's a little bit mentioned by Natasha, is intersectionality. We try our practice, within us and also with our members and among the community, we try to create spaces that are intersectional, safe and empowering, because that's not the case, unfortunately, in the domestic abuse policies. They don't reflect on that. Also, they are, placed in papers and policies, but it's not always the same. One example that really baffles me, and I know many organizations are trying to, they're fighting for it, is the domestic abuse article in 2021, which is like to anyone who's being subjected to domestic abuse have a safe plan, safeguarding. But that very important policy left migrant women behind, women whose visa and their life depends on their husbands or partners' visa, and they're not entitled to go to refuge because they're not entitled to recourse to public fund. How many women, you call the national helpline and then they ask, okay, and then the question, what's her immigration status? And it stops there. And, it's really unbelievable and really, really difficult to turn around to the woman and say, we're really sorry, we can't help you because you don't belong, like you don't, this is a very difficult, very good example, but very difficult situation that many people do not understand, or it doesn't come in their day-to-day life, but it affects so many women and children in schools and across the community. So that's another issue. And one last thing is, again, interesting, the trust, ensuring the trust and cooperation between the secular and the faith-based systems, as they both have different priorities. These are the few challenges. Strategies. So how we do it is we build relationship. That's a long-term based on trust. That's why the 45 members, it's growing within the last 2-3 years. So it's really rapidly growing. We are movement builders by offering support, resources, and we create platform. Funders will come to us. So we connect them with faith-based organizations or women activists and, movements. We also create community for our members. So we have regular monthly platforms they can meet up and, because they're not lonely, where you don't work in solo now, you have allies, so come together. We also have public activities to do that. But most importantly, we are open to learning. We are always, we don't think we know it all. We're not anywhere near, we're work in progress. So we listen to our members, we listen to our partners, we listen to anyone who has a better practice, and we learn from the lesson, and we continue to move on. These are some of the examples.
Thank you. Yeah, it is a lot of work. So thank you for doing this and also for sharing. So we also have a better understanding that sometimes we overlook. We think it's very simple. You just call the helpline and you get support, but it's not always that straightforward, unfortunately. But I do recognize that those services are still very important to be in place, and that's when I'm going back to Joht, because you did mention about those tools that we can use for finding organizations. I would like to know your opinion, how crucial they are, and also if you could share some of your key findings from your research with our audience so we understand a little bit more the issues.
Yeah, no, thank you also. I think one of the joys of webinars like this is also just really amazing to hear some of the inspiring work from some of the other speakers, because I feel like I've learned quite a lot also just during the course of the evening as well. So I think, yeah, very specifically just on that point, actually, how do we sort of match services to survivors as per their need? This is something which our team's been doing quite a bit of work on sort of since the pandemic. So during the pandemic, the Department of Health and Social Care, through the National Institute of Health and Care Research, funded our team to sort of undertake a mapping exercise to get an idea just in terms of what the current service provision looks like in terms of remote support services. So as if everyone can cast their mind back to the pandemic, obviously there's a big shift in terms of no longer able to provide face-to-face services, thinking about sort of what the remote service options look like. And actually now we're a few years from what the back end of that sort of immediate aftermath of the pandemic was. We've still seen that a lot of services have still sort of reverted either to a hybrid or a remote sort of approach. So our team actually took a slight diversion, actually, just in terms of some of the work that we did. So originally we were sort of commissioned to do some work understanding what the services are that currently exist, and in particular, what we're quite interested in understanding is which of those services have been evaluated, and actually also quite importantly, which is picking on a point that Elsa mentioned. So when services have been evaluated or services are provided to certain groups, could they possibly inadvertently widen inequalities in some groups? So sometimes when we look to create a service, we don't necessarily think about how they affect every member of every subpopulation who might engage or use that service. So actually, Natasha mentioned that concept about intersectionality. So sometimes, services might be created for a specific ethnic group or a specific socio-demographic group. But the truth is that, if we take ethnic groups, for example, there's so much diversity within certain groups actually that often, even a service design in that space sometimes doesn't work effectively and could inadvertently widen inequalities. So we did a lot of work sort of mapping what the current service provision looks like in the UK, and to provide that information to the government to give an indication just of sort of where the needs are. And we're really delighted to see actually that one of the government's responses is that they're now funding a lot more research money and sort of evaluation money to try and understand, what the impacts of certain services are. But something really exciting and interesting also happened during that process. So, as I mentioned right from the start, I think if we want to do effective research or effective work in the space, it's really important to have the voice of survivors at every step. So, alongside a lot of that work that we did, we consulted at every stage with lots of groups of sort of survivors of victims of violence. And, we realized a very important point, which is, in some ways something that we tend to overlook sometimes in academia, but if we have gone through the effort of creating this, undertaking this mapping work, creating these directories, can we do something more effective or useful with that information that could actually benefit survivors? So a lot of our survivor panels suggested the idea of actually developing that into a mobile app. So that's just an example of a tool just to help survivors identify specific services that might sort of address specific needs. So there's no quite sort of tools that exist like that on the market at the moment in this context. So what I mean by that, for example, if you're a member of a certain intersectional group, are there potential services that you just may not have been aware of that could be in your local area or also more broad? I think one of the things that the pandemic really showed us is moving towards more digital tools like this. One of the really exciting things in this particular field is that previously, if you, for example, lived in a rural area, your access to certain services was quite limited. But actually, since a lot of services have moved to more hybrid or virtual options, a lot of survivors now also potentially have access to services outside of their region. So that kind of connecting those dots is something which has not really happened very, very seamlessly since. But there's a great opportunity in doing so. So we've spent quite a bit of time just trying to put that together. So that particular app is not yet released, but it's hopefully going to be released actually within these 16 days of activism, which is quite exciting. But I think just more broadly speaking, so the role of tools such as that or others, I think in improving access it can be really transformative. So I think for survivors, just as I mentioned, these kind of tools can eliminate some barriers, simplifying the process of sort of finding that tailored support. And I think just also speaking actually also to a point which Elsa and I mentioned also, I guess Natasha touched on this as well. If you are a survivor of violence, we're in a really, you can be in quite an overwhelming position, not just in terms of understanding what's happened and processing the trauma, but also in terms of understanding the support pathway that exists depending on your personal needs. So what I mean by that is yes, there are lots of, we're very fortunate that there are some front door services, but then actually the pathway after those front door services can be quite a mystery and also quite convoluted depending on your personal needs or personal expectations, just as Elsa mentioned. So tools, solutions, digital options like this can kind of hopefully streamline some of those pathways and actually provide filters or sort of approaches like that. So I think that's really important. And then just linked to something which I mentioned earlier, these sort of tools can be also quite bystanders or people who witness abuse as well. I mean, just as we sort of, many people want to do something to help, but sometimes you just don't know where to start in this space. And having just access to tools or being aware of tools like this is at least a starting point. So hopefully it just empowers communities. But just as I guess, just as a third point, as I briefly mentioned, these sort of tools can have broader impacts just on accessibility as well. So hopefully they can break down barriers, particularly for certain groups. Equally, at the same time, I'm also conscious that sometimes moving towards more digital approaches can also in itself create barriers for certain groups. So I think it's most important to have a mixture of both digital and face-to-face services. But I mean, we're still sort of seeing what the full impacts of that are at the moment. But yeah, I think really looking ahead, I think tools like this are going to become an essential part of the arsenal actually to combat gender-based violence, particularly in this country.
Thank you. I would like to ask all of the speakers, are there personal and home behaviors that we all can try to change, and how can we later implement this change to a broader community level? And also, kind of, how do we react to misogyny remarks, jokes, and this sort of things?
I'm happy to get started on
Yeah.
that. That's what we do. So, yeah, I'd say the one thing that you can do at home, or that you can recommend people to do to start tackling gender-based violence, is to start conversations about it. And that sounds really simple. I think a lot of the time in our work, people are looking for some like magic solution to this. And unfortunately, if we had that, we would be in a very different place as a society. So for us, it's about that the solution that actually feels almost like the simplest, but it can be the most transformative, is practicing holding conversations and talking about it. It is still such a taboo topic in a lot of homes and a lot of spaces and a lot of communities and a lot of workplaces. And just starting to have that conversation is really, really important. That can feel really scary and overwhelming. So what we say is like, start small. Like, again, you don't have to start actually talking about gender-based violence. You can start by talking about gender stereotypes, attitudes that you see, language that you hear. And that can be a way into the conversation that can lead to conversations about gender-based violence later down the line. So we have lots of resources for starting those conversations on our website, including like a set of 16 conversation starters. So that can be a great place to go to give some kind of stimulus for talking about it, so you're not just kind of starting out of nowhere. And your second question on how do we challenge misogynistic attitudes and language, something I mentioned earlier that I'll come back to is this idea of calling in, which is the idea that you're not telling somebody off for something that they said, but you're being curious about why they said it and why it might be harmful. What we tend to find with a lot of language and attitudes is that the intention isn't to cause harm, even though the outcome might be. And so a calling in is a way of helping someone to see that what they've said or the attitude they've displayed is harmful, even if they didn't intend for it to be. So it's a gentler approach, and it's more of like a education together approach, which is one of the most powerful ways to change language and to change attitude, because ultimately, like, if you tell somebody not to say something, that's not gonna help them to see why what they said was harmful, or it's probably not going to stop them from saying it. They might say it in a different place, not around you. So calling in is a way of helping them to kind of slowly change their language and attitude. We talk about the idea of like planting seeds that will grow over time rather than being like immediate changes. So yeah, hopefully that helps a little bit with that.
I would like to add on what Natasha said. I think it's mentioned before because you mentioned personal and home behaviors. So I think the personal one is, having a believing attitude. I think it's mentioned before. When somebody tell us I'm going through this, try not to dismiss it, and, making them feel like they've heard and they can get the support from us is really important. I know it can be overwhelming, especially if it's an area we're not comfortable or we don't know much about, but it's good attitude to have a believing attitude in the first place. The other thing I want to mention about home behaviors is, if we take, for example, domestic abuse, it's mainly considered when there is physical abuse, like, seeing bruises and that kind of violence, but really understand that there are all forms of abuse, like there is emotional abuse, there is psychological abuse, all these things, they add up to domestic abuse, and understanding that will be very helpful. So this can be within the family context and also in the faith community context, because people regularly go to their place of worship, so not feeling like, oh, something is off, but I don't know what it is, but like understanding that and approaching that person and say, do you want to talk about it? Is there anything I can do? I hear you, makes a difference. But then also what makes a difference will be to have that trauma-informed approach. What trauma-informed means putting ourselves in that person's shoes, not assume that is what they want. Oh, you're going through this, so let's call to the national helpline. No, everyone has their own step and stage of, like, they might understand they're going through domestic abuse, but some may not, or they might have, but they don't want to take action now. Or, so the very important question is like, what do you want? It's really important. We use this for secular organizations as well. We have a VAWG sector, because everyone has the form which says, do you have religion? Yes, tick. But then we say, okay, what is that for? Why can't you ask the woman, oh, I noticed you said you have faith. What do you want to do about it? And some big domestic abuse organization said, oh yeah, no, we just refer them to the local mosque or to the local church. But what if she doesn't want to? Because there's discrimination, there's stigmatization. Maybe she's running away from that. So just asking the simple question of, what do you want? How can we help? Really makes a difference. We're giving her voice back. We're giving, the children's voice back, asking them, what do you want? How can I help? Rather than, jumping into solutions. That's really important. The last one, and when it comes to faith communities, everyone has safeguarding policies. A policy that, it's like a standard which is filed somewhere else. But I think it should be not a policy, but a safety plan. Anyone who's coming to the congregation or the church is looked after. It's a practical one, that anyone feels safe. And if something goes wrong, or if something didn't go as it's planned, this is how we help you, or this is how we can help you, not just a ticking box. I think that needs a lot of attention to make a difference. Thank you.
I'm happy just to add just a few sentences, because Natasha and Elsa's comments were extremely comprehensive. I think just in terms of sort of those home and personal behaviours, I think ultimately we've just got to foster a culture of respect and equality at home. So just that, I mean, Natasha really just commented on this at the start, but just sort of understanding sharing responsibilities and just trying to encourage that open dialogue around gender equity. And when it comes to sort of just how to react to misogyny, I think one psychological theory that I've seen used a lot in practice here is this idea of the social learning theory. So it's this concept that a theory that people learn new behaviors by observing and imitating others. So there's also something to play in the sense of actually that we have a responsibility to reframe some of the conversations. So offering those alternative perspectives could also potentially refocus actually what other individuals might be thinking in their own behavior. So it's just another approach to sort of dealing with that. But I think, yeah, Natasha and Elsa covered it really comprehensively.
I would like to open the floor for questions now from the audience.
Thank you. I'd like to say to Natasha something she might find interesting that's happening in my area. I live in Renfrewshire in Scotland, and we have a local playwright and author called Alan Bissett, who has written a book called Lads, and it's aimed towards teenage boys. And it's all about consent and respect. And the way he's written it, a teenage boy would read it. It's very well presented. And interestingly, he's been allowed into every secondary school in my area to speak to the teenage boys, which I think is a great move forward. He also says of himself, he's a good witness, because there are things he's ashamed of that he said and did when he was young that showed lack of respect. So I think he's a very good witness. The other thing I wanted to say was that in our group, the Renfrew, our interfaith group in domestic abuse, we got the opportunity to go into 2 prisons, Shotts Prison and Greenock Prison. One of them is male and female, the other one's all male. And we did a course on domestic abuse. We worked with the staff first so that they knew what we were saying to the prisoners, and then we worked with the prisoners. It was a whole interesting experience. The most interesting thing was when we're speaking to the women in Greenock Prison, we showed them a video about rural abuse, and we watched them watching it, and every single one of them was nodding her head as if, I know exactly what that's like. So it's a bit like you said, Professor Joht, you know, there are other layers. When people are in trouble, there's whole other layers beneath that helps explain why they finish up where they are. And the 2 of us who worked in that prison left that prison in complete silence. We felt so humbled because what we realised was we were so lucky. That was never going to happen to us because of the lucky upbringing we'd had. It was never going to happen to us that we'd finish in prison, but other people are not so fortunate.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
I could literally go on all night, but I'll just pick up on one thing because I think this is quite key to this meeting this evening. All of my cases involve family law. I only work with victims who have children. Something really interesting happened a few weeks ago, and it's the first time in over 4 years that I've ever seen this. For anybody that's gone through the family courts, I'll just explain very quickly. Whether you're in England, Wales, maybe Scotland, I don't know the Scotland process, so I apologise. But in England and Wales, if you make a family court application, Cafcass or Cafcass Cymru will always become involved, and they will do safeguarding reports and Section 7 reports, which are slightly longer reports. Now, one particular survivor that I was working with, she's got a couple of children. Within the Cafcass report, the Cafcass officer actually cited spiritual abuse for this particular survivor. I've never seen that before. When it went in front of the judge laughed at that particular sentence, did not recognize spiritual abuse whatsoever. And my jaw hit the ground because spiritual abuse is linked to emotional abuse, psychological abuse. You know, we all get that. But from my experience, how can we support, you know, I'm specialist trained, how can we continue to support victims and survivors when it comes to court if judges themselves are not trained or do not recognize what is going on? So it's a real gripe. And I actually sit on the family council for the family courts, and it's just so annoying that people don't get it. So that was just my feedback, and I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts on that, but I thought I would just personally share that because it really was one of those moments. So yeah, there you go.
Unfortunately, that's the case in many professionals. That's why, like, you know, it's really important to highlight and keep the awareness raising for people to understand, because, you know, the othering of or it's their religion or it's their faith, so we don't know how to deal with it, or, you know, it applies, but there's really good guidance that, you know, on our website, which I'm going to put the link here, that might help. It's a good highlight that might help for anyone who could want to read. And also, we, you know, contact us. We have a toolkit. We worked on it a lot for about months, involving survivors and different members and different faith groups, which highlights, like, from the Jewish perspective, Sikh perspective, Muslim perspective, and Christian. Hopefully next year we'll be able to roll out, you know, for anyone who's interested to learn and understand the highlights of spiritual abuse. But I really understand what you mean, Nick, because we used to sit with the Marak team, and, you know, we read the report and, you know, like, but she, you know, there's something here, but you missed out. You know, it's always missed out. But we'll get there one day, hopefully. That's my hope.
Brilliant. Thank you.
To be honest, actually, Elsa gave such a brilliant response. Actually, is not a huge amount to add. I was only just gonna also just mention, actually, Nick, it is a really sad case. In fairness, the first thing I thought is quite remarkable, actually, that the officer did mention this in the first place. And in some ways, I'm actually more impressed that actually local forces are considering it in that sense, because I mean, it's just to get this concept recognized more broadly as it is as an issue in its own right. But actually, you're absolutely right. I think one of the things which we do struggle with is, and a lot of the survivor groups that we've worked with, particularly over the last couple of years, just in terms of priority setting, have noticed that there's specific training needs for certain professional groups. And it's funny, a lot of the time and money that's invested in terms of training professional groups often tends to be sort of poured into law enforcement. So in terms of police forces, which I think is absolutely right, because without doubt, it's really critical that police forces have a good understanding of what the consequences of violence are, how best to address or sort of support it. But actually, when it comes to the legal system, that's where most survivors do tend to feel quite let down. And I think, Nick, your comment did also highlight this. So I think there has to be a system-wide change actually, just to advocate for more training, particularly for legal services, because I mean, from the survivors that we've engaged in, some of the work, some of the trials that we've done, often it's in the legal system where their cases get lost. And I think that in itself, we shouldn't really underestimate what the impacts. I mean, from my perspective, working in health in this area, what the impacts on people's mental and physical health is just from having a case lost in that myriad of a system. So yeah, my comment is more of a comment and not really a response per se, but yeah, Nick, absolutely, completely. It's quite remarkable, the situation. But Elsa gave a great response. So.
Can I add one more sentence, Nick, because you mentioned family court? I think family court is one of the difficult sector, you would say, to get into for any training, because children are involved. So it's very closed and it's not open to, some criminal justice areas. I know some of my colleagues work hard, to work with them, but family court is one of the really difficult ones. So if you have a tip how we can get into, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, what I can say is some family courts are open now under the Transparency Project, so you might be able to attend. But one thing, there is a massive reform taking place within the family courts. It has been for the last 2 years. It started in North Wales and Sussex. It's now rolled out to nearly all the courts in Wales. It's called Pathfinder. It is an absolute disaster, because the normal process in the family court, you make your court application. If it's an emergency, you'll get heard within a couple of days. I'm forever applying for non-molestation orders or occupation orders. But if it's just a normal child arrangements order, you're looking months to get your first hearing. What they've done is they've brought out Pathfinder, whereas everything could be dealt with on the first hearing. So the children are spoken to before the first hearing by CAFCAS, and the report is sent to the judge. In my experience, this is not good for victims or survivors, because the extent of what is happening is not coming out. And what we're seeing is judges are issuing the wrong orders, and then they're issuing what's called barring orders, preventing victims and survivors from going back to court. It's not a good system at the moment, but you are right. The family court, I've seen good orders and I've seen bad orders, and it's more or less bad orders most of the time, to be honest. Victims and survivors just are not listened to or are overlooked. Again, I could spend all night on this. I won't, but yeah. So there we are.
Thank you. It's amazing how so much amazing work has been done, and that it impacts on me just when you present everything that you are doing, that there are the front end of dealing with the victims after the abuse has happened, but there is also the education that happens before that, and hoping that it doesn't ever get to that stage. And as in other areas of work, and trying to tackle a problem this large and this overreaching into every corner of our society, that I feel very much that, exactly as Elsa has said, that if we go in with the religious flag, the religious people will think that we're secular, and the secular people think that we're religious, and it's fairly hard to do. And also there is the generational thing, that when work like Natasha's doing, you're dealing with the young people, you're also dealing with the people who educate them. So if we take one step back from that, even, it's how they grow up, it's how they deal with things, deal with conflict, deal with disagreements and everything, that allows that narrative that even how they speak to each other, how is it allowed, and the way we speak to each other, almost everything builds up the character that maybe they don't think is abuse, but that it turns out to be. And if we just tackle it as in saying that, oh, that's abuse and that's wrong, some of them don't know how they got it. It just came because that's how they grew up, or the group that they deal with each other. And then, like what Nick says, that when you then have the tail of people who have done with the court cases or done with decisions, but where goes the support? It's almost like a cliff edge that you just fall off because your case is done, or somebody has announced that this is all dealt with in the legal side of things. But so it's, if we go from where they had the germination of what's allowed to be done to other people, to after the damage is done, how do we then also pick up? Leads me to think that people just need to work together, because you all do a section of the work. And one of the things that happened in the past year is that the government had withdrawn funding for Interfaith Network. And Interfaith Network sort of got us all together. They list us and we know kind of who each other are, and that we don't anymore. We now have to know who they are to go and look them up. So as much as Professor Joht has an app that now is trying to get all those information together for people with this kind of an issue can go and look it up, it's increasingly more important for those of us who work in similar fields to know who each other are, because we do different things, and to be able to reach each other. I'm going to put a link in our chat. Ever since Interfaith Network has been shut down in no uncertain terms, there is a real need for us to be able to reach each other. We'll try to do evenings like this where we can come together and talk together, but it is also important that everybody is listed who's doing any kind of peace work, to be able to have a public facing face, so that you are visible, so that your work is out there for everybody to see. So we're developing a network for almost like a phone book for everybody who does work like this, and it would be important for us to do a good job in linking people together beyond this evening and into our work, into more detailed pieces of work that each other do, and be able to work together from time to time, and to reach each other for advice and things like that. So I'll drop my link in the chat so that you can all access. It's a platform where you can go and register and then put your information online, pick public facing ones, so that other people can see what area of work you do, and your website or your social media or your public facing contact details, so that we can reach each other. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know if this is allowed or not, but Cindy just raised some good points there. This is in no way an endorsement, and I won't mention the charity's name unless I get permission, but I think the professor said earlier about the government recognising something. There is a very, very well-known organisation in the UK that train police officers, social workers, myself and others in domestic abuse, sexual violence, working with young children, everything. And at the moment, the government have given them millions of pounds of funding, so it's all subsidised training. So if you're interested in that sort of training, I don't work for them and it's not an endorsement, but it might be an option, if you wanted to look at it, because a course that costs £1,700 might only cost you £30 now. So that training is available because of central government recognising what is going on. I'm happy to say who they are, and most people know who they are straight away. But that training is available, and you can get level 3 or level 4 qualifications from this as well. So that might be an option if anybody was looking at that. If you're going to be working with domestic abuse victims, sexual violence victims, support victims, that is there. So that might be an option if anybody wanted to look at that.
Because we are also approaching the end, and I don't want the speakers to leave before answering this this question, so I'll make it myself. Uh, if there is one takeaway or action step they want the audience to remember after the discussion, what will be? This is for all the speakers.
I'm happy to go first. Might be easier to say it first.
Yeah.
I think the key reflection from my perspective is I think every action, no matter how small it is, it does contribute to ending this crisis. So I think, from my perspective, start where you are. So challenge those harmful norms, support survivors, and advocate for change in your sphere of influence. We shouldn't underestimate. Yes, I know Cindy made a really good point about the fact that there are bigger things that need to happen in the space, but if we only focus on the big things, then we won't actually make any change in our local spaces. So do focus on your sphere of influence as well. So that's probably just a comment from me.
I mean, yeah, mine's very similar to Joht, as you said, probably good going first. We sometimes use the metaphor of things can feel very overwhelming and like this huge big weaved web of violence and inequality. But even if you're just pulling on one thread of that, you are making a difference and you can make a difference. And something I said earlier, which I come back to, which is literally just start by talking about it and having that conversation, because that is far more has far more impact than we might think it does. So just starting small with have one conversation and see where it goes from there.
So the importance of the role of faith in survivors' lives and their families, it's really important. And also understanding spiritual abuse or weaponizing of faith, it's really important to understand. So we invite any faith leaders to join our charity to build strategy to role of faith to ending violence against women and girls. So everyone is welcome to join us. It's a long way, but we can do it together.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it is important to keep motivated and inspired. So maybe there's another question, sorry, but how would you say for people to keep motivating in doing, and how do you yourselves keep motivated? Because we know that there are lots of challenges. It is very complicated. You do very hard work. So you do need some self-motivation. What do you do for yourselves? What would you do? What would you say for people who are interested in supporting the cause?
My half of my life I spent working on the rights, sexual reproductive health and rights of women and girls. And it could be overwhelming, as you said, but I think my motto all the time is if I can if I can support one girl or one woman, so that goes a long way. That's my aim. My target is one woman out there, just I will start from her. So that's, that keeps you going. That woman goes and helps somebody else, and that goes a long way.
I feel like it's kind of cheating because working with young people is the only like inspiration and motivation that I find that we need at Bold Voices, because we work with so many young people every day, every week, every month who are already so clued up about this and challenging it in their own spheres already, and who've gone out there and found out information for themselves. And that honestly is, if they can find the motivation and the passion to do it, then that just like keeps you going every single day. And to know that change, like young people really want change to happen, and they're really doing anything they can to make that happen. And I really believe that that will lead to kind of tangible change. So yeah.
Yeah, I didn't feel it was fair for me to go first again that time. So I think just to add to what Elsa and Natasha said, I think from my perspective, it's just also important to reflect on your why. So I mean, just to always remember what your personal reasons for what brought you to this work, and also just support yourself with colleagues who share that vision. I think the other thing which is quite important is you can't pour from an empty cup. So there's something also in this about sort of practicing self-care and also setting boundaries for yourself. So one thing which I always find quite amazing is I do actually draw a lot of inspiration from survivors, because the remarkable thing is yeah, we are talking today about how do we support survivors, but actually one of the most inspirational things I've seen is actually how survivors support other survivors and actually this space, and also how they support people who work in this space. So, you know, the resilience that people have demonstrated in spite of the sheer terror that they've been in is just actually in itself a major inspiration and one key reason to, you know, why you might want to work in this area. But I think just in summary, just focus on what you can control rather than the overwhelming scale of the issue. But just visualize what the long-term impact of your contributions can be. So yeah, I think I wouldn't change anything at all. I think actually just every day I feel more inspired to want to work in this space.
Thank you for the three of you for the sharing your where your inspiration comes from. I find it very interesting, and I know that it's difficult to keep on when you are facing a lot of challenging, but yeah, you have your motivation. That's what keeps you strong.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just a case of, you know, the more people get involved, the more emotional drain that you're going to feel as well. And this is from experience. I've gone through vicarious trauma, burnout, as we call it, myself, you know, because we want to help people. We really want to help people. So always, you know, depending on what you do, always keep safe caseloads. Don't overdo it. You've got to look after yourself, whether you take some time out, go for a walk or do something you enjoy, cooking, baking, anything like that. Because if you keep going on and on and on, you're going to be no good to yourself or to those survivors that you want to support. So always look after yourself and your own mental health. That would be what I would advise, and that is from experience. And as the professor said, I've been doing this job 5 years. I've got lived with experience. I was a victim myself 5 years ago. I went from a victim to a strong advocate supporting others. I got trained up. So, you know, I get what he was saying. I'm in this because I don't want anybody to go through what I went through myself. So I really do get it. And that is my passion. But because of my passion, you can suffer that burnout as well. So you've got to set yourself a limit. And trust me, this is from experience. Just look after yourselves at the same time.
Thank you very much for sharing, and thanks for your contribution and all speakers' contribution. I'm pretty sure also for other people from the audience who also do well. Just the fact that you are here up for this discussion already shows that you are interested, and you know the importance of these conversations. And I hope that everybody got inspired. We showcased three amazing speakers. They are doing a lot of hard work. That's what we wanted to show. That despite of all the difficulties, there are people and organizations that do a lot. And I hope that you get some insights from them. Also, well, inspiration, insights, understand, and that you, everybody leaving this session, that the inspiration still continues with you, that you can go out and you can challenge yourself, your own behaviors, and support the work in your own capacity. They could be volunteering, joining these organizations or others that are doing hard work, or donating to their work, to support their work, or even within yourselves, as Natasha said, and I think all speakers, to have these discussions, to learn more. All those things already make a huge difference. And thanks Cindy as well, our chair, for the comments, and also for leaving the link. Please, everybody, check the link there. Cindy has put it there, because it's very important to keep connected, and then united we can do a lot more, and we can collaborate. And I would also like to emphasize, we as RFP UK, we would like to continue collaborating with both voices, with Faith and VAWG, and with Professor Joht in different ways, in the ways that you think it will be more appropriate. We really want to support your work, and we hope that we can continue this collaboration further, because we aim for the same objective, that is ending the inequality and also the gender-based violence. And for all the participants, thank you very much for your interest, for your contributions. And yeah, I hope you took some inspiration, and that you come back also for other sessions that we have in future. Good night, everyone. Hope you have a nice
Thank
evening.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank